Perfect.
We
Hi,
are
everybody.
there.
So just to let you know that we are now live. So we do have an audience very eager to hear your insights. So to formally introduce the session, the first discussion of the day, or the first session of the day, is actually a panel discussion. And the title of the session is Developing the Roadmap Towards Optimized, Connected Smart Labs of the Future. So, I mean, it goes without saying, as I mentioned before, excited for everyone to be here. Hope you'll find it a really interesting discussion. I've met these panelists before. I've had numerous conversations with them. So I do expect it to be a very insightful and hopefully a lively discussion as well. Hopefully you'll get some good nuggets of information. So to formally introduce everyone, we have Cindy Novak-DeLaurel, who's Senior Manager Lab Operations Systems, Bristol Myers Squibb. Mary Belfast, Senior Scientist, Automation Manager, Teva Pharmaceuticals. Philippe Albrecht, Senior Scientist, Discovery Informatics for Roche. And Valerie Polyakov, Head of Computational Chemistry, Sutro Biopharma. And finally, your moderator, Peter Lee, who is the Director of Science and Technology for Strateos. So in my introduction, I did make a very quick couple of announcements. Just a reminder, attendees, you joined in listen-only mode. That means that you're muted, but there is a Q&A section as well. So if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, there's several tabs in grey. There's one that says Q&A. If you have any questions, please jot them in there. We'll say we can either wind the question, if the questions are relevant, we can wind them into the conversation. Otherwise, we'll pick them up towards the back end of the session. So that's it from me, really. I'll hand you over to these guys and let you get into the good stuff. So I hope you enjoy the session, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our panel discussion. As Mark was saying, I think it's going to be a really insightful session. We've had some previous chats already, and I'm excited for what we're going to be talking about. So I'm Peter Lee. I'm Director of Science and Technology over at Strateos, where we've been connecting scientists with smart labs and smart automation to accelerate discovery, both through our cloud lab service that really connects scientists. They can sign up right away and get access to all of our own automation, and then also through our software that can be deployed on your own labs and be used to make them smarter. Based on the conversation that I've had so far with everyone, I'm really excited about our panel discussion today, and about thinking about how what are smart labs and how are we starting to develop them. What are the trends in the industry? And I know we will have a lot of insightful discourse. Before I start bringing the panelists in and asking them to introduce themselves, I also again want to encourage everyone to jump in and participate. We'd love to know where you're coming from in the discussion section. So if you like, please go in there and just start introducing yourselves as well. And then also, as Mark was talking about, use the Q&A panel. Click in there, ask questions. We've talked to all the panelists. We all agree that there's a lot of value coming out of the questions coming from the audience. So I'll be looking at those and bringing those in. If you see questions already there that are echoing the things that you want, like them, and I'll be sorting on based off of likes and stuff like that. So I'll make sure to bring those in with more priority. With that, let me introduce the panel. I'll start with Cindy. Maybe you could talk about yourself. Cindy's from BMS, and one of the cool things that I discovered is that she's an air show coordinator, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that in your introduction.
Sure, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Cindy Novak-DeLaurel. I have been at Bristol Myers Squibb for about a year now, and I am responsible for all of our computerized systems in the labs that are linked to instruments. So this is definitely a topic as far as connecting smart labs is very near and dear to my heart. And I've been involved in various aspects of this for probably the last 5 or 6 years easily, if not more. As Peter mentioned on the side, I have been for the last 11 years now the air show coordinator for Planes of Fame in Southern California, and which means that I recruit and manage about 400 people for an entire weekend and sit there in the sun and watch a bunch of old World War II planes and modern jets fly around. So that's my other passion, is aviation and history. So.
Great. Next, I'll throw to Philippe over at Roche, and I know all of your different opportunities and things have taken you to a lot of places, and you have a lot of travel experience, and we'd love to hear a little bit about that too.
So thank you for the opportunity. So I'm Felipe. I work at Roche in Basel. I work in the PRED, the pharma research part of Roche, in the informatics side, where I support lab automation, mainly with the data part. My passion is about data, obtain the data, organize the data, make now that this new fancy term that make the data fair. But I really enjoy this part, and I think it's very connected to the smart labs. From what Peter said, in the last 12 years, I live in more than 5 different countries, in different continents. I'm from Brazil, United States, Germany, Japan, and now in Switzerland. It's not I like to travel, but it's necessary, I think, in life to connect with different people, different cultures, and even different ways of working. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll go to Mary next. As was mentioned, Mary's over at Teva and has spent some part of life in the Navy, and I think interesting experiences from there. I'd love to hear more about that.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, my career actually started in the Navy. I did about 4.5 years, and then I moved from there into the medical field, and then eventually into the pharma, where I got into automation. But in retrospect, I actually started automating things when I was in the Navy, because like any wonderful government agency, they like everything done in quadruplicates. And we had these forms that we had to do for everyone, and the sites would the commands would be, anywhere from 100 to a couple hundred people, and it was pretty much the same form. Now, this is going to date myself. So I had started putting these forms onto our computer, which was at the time a small 4x5 monitor CRT that was bigger than my desk, and we used what was called peach text. So it was, and it didn't give you the nice Word document that you see today. It was, underscore, and then you had your word and then an underscore, and what you saw on the screen was nothing like what you saw when you printed it off. I see Cindy laughing, so she's familiar with similar software. But like Philippe, I managed to live in a number of different cultures. Spain and Scotland were my 2 favorite places.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mary. And rounding out our panel, we have Valerie, who's from Sutro, and in addition to all of our combined Smart Lab experience, has a passion for underwater sports. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, so I'm the director of computational chemistry at Sutro Biopharma, which is a small, well, relatively small, about 200 people company in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. Before that, I actually spent most of my industrial career working for very large pharma companies like Novartis, and before that Sanofi. But my interest in automation actually started with when I began my industrial career with a very small company called ChemCodes, where I was the lead software developer, and I implemented chemical software developer, and I implemented a way of quickly browsing through the wells and connecting several apparatus from sort of the robotic arm to the mass spec, and then make a decision on the fly whether to continue measuring these spectra. And so that's. But speaking of underwater sports, I frankly say I miss the travel because I like to dive in the warm seas, but I am a free diver, so I don't trust any technology when it's on my back, and so I will rather trust my body. I had a couple encounters with the sharks. I have to tell they were pleasant for both of us. And so now I miss the travel, so I bought a wetsuit, and so I have no choice but to dive in the monastery beach. So if you guys want to join me, I'm waiting for, when the waves will subside, and then I can go in the water.
I know, the Bay Area water is or can be quite cold, but sounds like you have it sounds like there's a dichotomy between your trust in automation in your work life, and then in not wanting any of that in your personal life.
True.
So I think to get us started, the term smart labs has sort of evolved organically from a lot of different places, and it's probably good to sort of define terms and think about, what do smart labs mean for you all, and what do you think it means for the industry? Where do you know that we've gotten to a smart lab, and what's been motivating you all towards that?
So I think, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. I think it really depends on where you're at currently. So this to me has meant different things at different companies. I started hearing about Smart Lab during my days at Allergan, and we were really enthusiastic about trying to connect our instruments to our limbs and our ELN. And that was, to us, that was Smart Lab. And then I moved on and I joined Shire, which became Takeda, and this grew into a much larger and more in-depth endeavor to try and really interconnect not just limbs and the instruments, but all of our systems and really build something more robust. And by the time I left Takeda, it was really exciting. We had built a facility in Ireland that our goal was no paper. So from day one, we were fully digital, and we were probably 85–90% successful in that endeavor. There were a couple systems that weren't quite ready when I left, but it was such an amazing journey to know that you're building from the ground up to be fully digital, and everything has to be connected and everything has to work. And you really have to give it a lot of thought up front to make this happen and be successful. And I left Takeda and I came to BMS, and our site, I have to rethink my whole idea of smart labs and connected labs, because the site that I'm at is a fairly young site that we've only recently joined the BMS family. And we have a ton of paper. And one of the things that I'm doing right now is saying, okay, how do we go and very simple forms, just make this digital instead of here's a paper form that we're now using to process requests. And so it really it depends on where you're at and where the company is at, but everybody is on the same journey in different ways, because we all see the value of eliminating that paper and interconnecting all of our systems and just making that data more accessible.
I think she made a really good point about interconnecting things. I think a smart lab is about interconnection. Even, for example, if you look in the brain, what the brain is, a lot of interconnected neurons. That's what makes us smart, intelligent. And so also, I think what we are talking about smart lab is there's a lot about the culture of the company. For some companies, having a paperless, but scanning out the documents and storing the shared folder is fully digitalized. It's perfect. But for others, and what I expect, a smart lab is some place that you connect the physical world and the data world. So we can have create synergy when you generate the data from different instruments. For the next step of the process, we already have some knowledge before. So that's, for me, I think, the smart part.
I agree with both Philippe and Cindy, but one of the problems that in Teva, I'm working in a regulated space, so bringing in smart technology is much more difficult, because we have to be able to demonstrate that smart technology is not going to introduce errors. And yeah, we can test it 10 times, but then the auditor's going to go, well, how do you know at test 100 it wouldn't fail? So it's not only connecting the instruments to the database and between the instruments, but it's also being able to show that those connections are functional and they will stand up to the data integrity tests and questions that auditors, the FDA, EU will have for us.
Fortunately, I am not in the regulated space. In fact, I am in as much deregulated space as you can imagine, which is research. And so for me, my dream is actually to develop something, and in one place or another, I started approaching that is to develop, and this is my definition of smart lab, is to develop a fully automated cycle, for example, that allows you to predict which compounds to make, predict the synthetic route or maybe a simple synthetic route, then make these compounds in an automated synthesizer, test them automatically without, basically have a robotic arm which would go into a testing machine, and then, collect the data, analyze the data, and automatically rebuild a more accurate model and then repeat this cycle. And so maybe that's too much, but but I think we do have the ability to implement something like this right now on a small scale, and that would help us, especially in the process of compound optimization. Not so the process of maybe lead finding is more or less automated. At least so you can actually do, I was building a lot of models for high throughput screening, which would be even better than high throughput screening. But the challenge is, how do you implement that on the small data sets which you are using in the compound, in the lead optimization? And so that might be a way to go, rather than sending, for example, stuff for synthesis to overseas and then getting the results back and then sending the compounds for testing to another overseas lab. And so having that all under one roof in seamless integration with the database and machine learning probably would be a highly desirable exercise.
Valerie, question for you on that. I find that really interesting, and being that you're from a smaller organization, as opposed to the Tevas and the Roche and BMS, do you find it more challenging to get approval and the funding and spend that money and the time and the energy to do this and be connected and move to the smart lab? That's such a, I would think it's a hard enough thing in a large organization. I can only imagine what you go through. How do you justify doing that in a smaller organization?
Actually, believe it or not, it might be easier. It might be easier in a small company. Again, my experience with the large companies, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons I decided I don't want to work for a big company, is the overwhelming bureaucracy. And I'm not against bureaucracy, especially if it's in a regulated field where you need it. But, if we're dealing with research and not development, but research, if you want to quickly optimize your compounds, if you want to find the leads, you have to somehow remove that layer of approval, and you somehow need to move faster. And yes, the challenge sometimes is money in the small company, but it's actually, I found it's actually easier to convince people that my crazy ideas will work in the small company than convince the 5 levels of management in the large company. So, yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a very interesting problem.
I find that so much is the management that I have to convince, aside from convincing them to get the money, because I think in large companies, as in small, money is always a hurdle that you have to overcome. But it's getting people out of their comfort zone. It's like, we've been doing this by paper for the last 150 years, and we're not moving, and it's amazing what kind of creative roadblocks people come up with to keep from moving into an automated space. I don't know if it's a comfort or if it's a fear of losing their job. It's a fear of the computer or the automated piece of equipment. But yeah, I think a lot of it, though, is just the ingrained, this is the way we've always done it, so why should we change mentality?
Do you run across, Mary? I know I've run across, we're regulated space. We can't do that.
Oh, my goodness.
That's my favorite argument, because there's nothing to back it up. We know better, which is why we're here and helping move them. But do you run into that?
all the time, and it
crazy.
gets down to like, but the SOP says this specifically, and how do I know I can do that? And it's like, well, if we make it an exception for every instance in that SOP is going to be longer than War and Peace. You know, so it's yes, get that all the time.
I think an interesting insight here is it may not be about smart labs, it may just be about smarter labs, right? It's like, what's the next step, or what's the next push, what's the next connection that we want to make between, what we have now and where we're going. And maybe that other side of it is it's kind of about like small company, large company, they have just different contexts of where they're starting from and what is that next transition. And maybe larger companies can have more baggage because there is like all this other setup stuff and things like that. And smaller companies may be more agile, but are starting from fewer resources. And so, just how you're kind of making that transition. How do you guys think about that of, just given your experiences, what are the ways that we make those steps? How do we, especially in the regulated sense and just in terms of overall change management, how do you start making that conversion within the organizations and groups that you're going to within whatever context that you're in? And I think it seems like the other side of this is, you all are always in sort of like improvement mode, right? And like, what can we do? How can we make this better? And that's a little bit of a maybe, I don't know, it's challenging, but scary or can be unfamiliar.
I think the first step is connect with people in the labs. The very first step. The project I worked at, and we didn't put priority on this, the project got much harder. To make the lab smarter, for example, what Mary say about people afraid of losing their jobs. We have to really clarify, it's not about firing people, it's about improving the work. The pharma process, my dog is here, it's time for him to walk in. You have a lot, we have to improve our efficiency of the process. We all know the cost is going up, the results going down. And we cannot hire 10 times more people. So we need to make this lab smarter to improve this efficiency. And how we do it slowly. We go with them, people in the lab, understand the pain and work with them. When we have a big project, at Roche we have usually big projects. We don't go big in our labs, but get to know each person or at least each key stakeholder in the project. So this way you can move forward and slowly. If you try to do some strong breakthrough, I'm afraid that's not the best way. I think slow steps and keep the people aligned is the best way.
I've noticed that younger people are much more open to automation as opposed to the older people that have been doing it in paper for the last 150 years. I've also noticed if I bring in small pieces of equipment to automate a particular bottleneck in a process, and they go, oh wow, this is really neat. What else can I do with it? And I kind of introduce it slowly and let them think it's their idea. And then it's just trying to convince our auditors that we are doing it in following all the different regulations we have out there, the USP and GAMP and whatnot.
Yeah. One of my favorite tactics, and I've been able to leverage this at the last few places I've worked, is being in constant merger acquisition mode in the last 10 years for my career. And I've been doing this a lot lately is, but our parent company that just adopted us, bought us out, they do it this way. And so we need to be aligned with them. And I actually leverage that a lot. And it helps you still get pushback, you still get resistance, because then it's, oh my gosh, the evil parent company. But then you show them, look, this is how much time you save. And never, ever say you're saving FTEs, because that scares, to your point, Mary, that scares people. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my job because of automation. And that's not the case at all. But so if you don't focus on FTE and you focus on, you're going to save time. So now these other 3 projects you want to do in the lab, or this method improvement or whatever you want to do, you now have time for that because, we've automated over here. But I absolutely enjoy being able to leverage a parent company to my advantage and do so frequently.
I hope no one from your future acquisitions listen this.
You know what? They all know it. I make no secret of it, to be honest. I try to be as transparent as possible.
Actually, Sandy, you're absolutely right, because that's what, when I was in working for large companies, we were in the process of constant, merging, unmerging, reorganization, and that was the best time when you could introduce change, because, during the such stale times, people were extremely reluctant to do anything new, and then when merger happens, when everyone is kind of afraid, or when a larger organization happens, that's when you can come up and approach someone and have it have some things done. So, but that's for large companies. It's a little bit different for smaller companies, because it's actually, in my opinion, it's significantly easier, because you normally start from the piece of white paper. I mean virtual paper, not not Mary, not the paper that Mary was talking about, but you start from scratch basically, and it actually goes significantly easier than that.
Let me bring in this question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
Building on what Cindy had said, and I can't remember, and I think it was Valerie who was talking about making an end-to-end connection. Teva has purchased a number of different companies, and now we have 1 billion different EDMS systems. And then now we have to try to bring them all into one, and that right there could be a smart lab application, where you move from having 4 different systems for your change controls and 6 different systems for how you manage your electronic documents into a single system for all of that. That right there could be very well a smart lab application. And it would make management happy, because now they have fewer IT resources supporting 1 million different, all these different systems. It makes everyone's life easier, because I go to one system to do this, I go to a different system to do that, and I have maybe 2 or 3 instead of what system do I need? Oh, this is the wrong system. So I think that's a application for smart labs.
I love being able to take advantage of these times of flux and think about all the different opportunities that they create to improve and make the systems better. And a pair of questions. The first one from Daisy that's come in. When you think about the infrastructure side of things, and I think Mary, you've already talked about this, bringing in maybe small pieces of equipment and things like that. But is there anything on the infrastructure that you would need in order to help this smart lab transition? Anything that you feel like are key pieces or key components?
It depends on how far they want to go. So if they're just trying to consolidate what they currently have, you need a strong IT department. Or if you have a small IT department and you're restricted on how many resources you have somebody in that department that's willing to learn to support this endeavor. Because you really need to have the technical support from the IT side, because most of these endeavors are software driven, and less on the automation, because there's the interface between your equipment and your connected lab, and then there's the interface with the connected lab to your electronic notebook or your reagent management system or your equipment management system. You have all these different systems. So having a strong IT department is very useful when you start these kind of projects.
Yeah, I would agree on the strong IT. I've resisted for a long time, but I've actually become a fan of cloud-based technologies and solutions, as opposed to hosting all your own infrastructure. And that's, of course, on the larger scale. But I think that it really helps in just adopting that mentality that's acceptable. And it's been a difficult transition, I think, especially in the regulated space, and people adopting it and accepting it and realizing that it can be secure. But being able to leverage that thinking and those thought processes, not necessarily fully cloud-based, but at least knowing what it can deliver to you and what it can facilitate. And then the other thing is really reaching out to, there's some really good vendors and resources out there that are experts at helping with these connectivities and the integrations and so forth. And reach out to the experts. That's what they do. As if you don't have your own internal resource to do it, as Mary, that's the perfect world, is you have your own IT resources that can do this. If not, know who to go talk to that can help facilitate it. And I think that that's really going to be key as well, is knowing where to go and who to talk to.
I think that tees up this other question from Jake perfectly in terms of outsourcing and how you all interact with that. I think there are 2 points in this question, and Jake, hopefully you'll forgive me for kind of bifurcating these. One, would you consider outsourcing these types of experiments? Could you consider having them be automated, or is it critical to be building these systems internally? And then 2, I know, right, like companies already do outsource their experiments. When you do that, how do you, are there things that you want to be considering for who is the outsourcing provider, and how do they match your smart labs, and how can they bring data back into your systems in the way that is compatible with what you've built?
For experience, I think that when we have these external companies outsource, is not just find a chip or even knowledge and for some short-term project, but it's about partnering with some external company. We have to keep in mind what's the business of a company and what we're going to deliver internally, or business and sides like pharma. We, from the IT department, we have to keep in mind that our business is pharma. We need to develop a system we can start internally. We have the stakeholders, the project owner, project leader internally, but is our business to develop software, or how much is to develop software? We need some key capabilities, but what can outsource? And when we outsource, the important point is to make a good partner for the future. Don't look for the project 6 months, 1 year, but look for a long-term partnership. Because when you outsource or when you work in a project, you generate a lot of knowledge there. And you want to reuse this knowledge in future projects, in future endeavors, in this new software and hardware deployment.
Yeah, I agree, Philippe, that this is a long-term project. It's not for your short-term. It's actually to improve the workflow, your internal workflow, to make it more efficient, and to free up your scientists so they can stop, spending hours doing, manual, monotonous data management kind of exercises, and actually look at the data. Dive down in that data and understand that data, because who knows, maybe you have the next blockbuster sitting in front of you, but because you're so caught up having to bring in these other data files manually, you miss it. So yeah, I think what Philippe said is very true.
Yeah, it's a difficult question whether you should or you should not outsource. I mean, on one hand, there are certain things you will definitely outsource, but generally, again, this is my personal experience, you would try to outsource sort of non-essential technologies. You would try to outsource routine work. I've never seen sort of partnering with the outsourcer that would usually be sort of like mainly like a fee for service. And I know that Roche has a completely different model, but every place that I worked and working now, we pay money, they deliver the product. There is no, and we kind of tell them what to do. In this case, I mean, there are advantages and obvious disadvantages in this kind of system, because and one advantage is that you tend to accumulate sort of the know-how and knowledge within the company rather than disperse it all over the world. But I agree, this is but there is, on the other hand, there is nothing wrong with sort of outsourcing a turnkey solution. where, it would be like an independent piece, sort of the smart lab would be run on the sort of in the other, not necessarily even in America, it's in the other world, in another country somewhere overseas. There is nothing wrong with that. But as long as you are controlling the technology, and plus, and my understanding, you need it for some legal reasons, because when you're gonna file, you want to make sure that you are protected in terms of IP coverage, and you're including all the co-authors.
I think
I think most companies. Oh, sorry, Philippe.
No, just one point about what outsources the commodity. Is some commodity work, some programming, some routine tasks, or you're outsourcing a key product of your company, a key AI, machine learning, data management system? Also, we are not going to build a software to find a lot in external companies selling for us, but we need to understand the knowledge for implementing this. So that's the balance, what we outsource and what you do inside. So we outsource what's common, routine, commodity, and inside you keep in the company the key parts. So that's, I think, is it.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies really have some sort of a hybrid model where we outsource where it makes sense. And I think we all do it to a certain degree, but I also think as several of my peers have mentioned, it's so important that you have the internal understanding as well, because at the end of the day, the regulatory agencies expect the internal resources to know, understand, and be able to answer any questions that are put forth to them. And I can't go and say, well, I need to go and talk to this company that I've outsourced this to. That's going to be completely unacceptable. And so even if you have a hybrid, having that knowledge in-house is critical.
I agree. Yeah.
I'll bring in, it's similar to what I think Maximilian has brought in on the discussion side. But are there due diligence type things that you need to be thinking about, during the outsourcing, or even on the internal side, right? Like when you, at the end of the day, you have to represent the outcomes of what's been coming from the smart labs, either internal or external. Are there processes that you think about, setting these things up beforehand, and do smart labs help you to do that? And I think maybe just extending on that, Mary was talking about working in these regulated fields. How do you, get more certainty that the systems that you're going to set up, the smart lab type systems, either internal or external again, are meeting the needs of the regulated field? So both due diligence pre-regulation and due diligence, within regulation.
If you do the due diligence up front and you really test the system, and this is where having, and I keep calling it a strong IT department, but as Cindy said, it doesn't necessarily have to be your internal IT. Maybe it's you have a point person in your IT guy group that can talk with a vendor on the computer language that they use, and then that person can come back and talk to the scientists and explain the systems, and then your regulated people or your compliance people can sit there and listen, and then they can ask questions, and they can delve down into, well, this isn't really well controlled, or maybe the roles and the permissions are too high level, they're not sufficiently granular, and you can walk through all those processes. So when you finally bring it into a regulated space, many of those questions are already answered, and you already know what your hurdles are going to be to implement that. And then it's just a matter of testing that to make sure that, testing it so you can actually prove that what you think the system is doing, it really is doing, and it's not doing it 99 times out of 100. That's the big hiccup right there. It'll do it 99 times, and then on the 100th transfer, it changes all the 9s to a 6 or something like that. That's what you need to watch out for, and that becomes the challenge.
And I think the other piece of that is after the fact, once you've implemented it and you've proven it and it works and you have that documented, is the change management and change control afterward. So one of the easy things, and I've run into this where, well, I'm changing this other system, so that doesn't affect, upstream or downstream. I'm just changing my piece of it. And you really need to have that understanding so that you know the impact of, and that's where your documentation comes in and that internal knowledge. If I make a change or my vendor makes a change, how does that impact everything else upstream and downstream? And that piece is so much more important as you connect more and more systems. So as you become a connected lab, everything affects everything else. And to know that and understand that and have people who can do those assessments up front is absolutely key.
Yeah, and having the labs overall understand that, yes, you may be handling, this small electronic pipetter or, the small plate washer, but it's connected to the larger system. And if you make a change here, it's going to affect everybody around you. So it becomes, education and communication becomes a much greater factor when you start connecting pieces.
Yeah, and I think not to be afraid of it. So there are software methodologies. So when you develop the software, you test the software in a certain way, and the same principles could be applied here in terms of constant testing what you're getting, running, and that's what people, by the way, in the lab are doing. So they're running with each experiment, they're running a set of standards, and so they're expecting the values from the standards to be or reference compounds, let's say, and they're expecting these values to remain the same. And if something changes, if for some reason, a reference on the same plate would give you completely different reading, then everyone knows something went wrong and you have to go back. And so those are simple controls which could be and should be implemented, we want to do the smart labs. And so I would call them stupid controls, but they're efficient.
I think we must not forget that smart labs is all powered by software. And companies forget all the boring and stupid controls of software, the testing, the specification. And so it's easy to forget about this because we are talking mainly about in the pharmaceutical space rather than IT space. So that's why there's a question about skill set. So in the skill set, we need a strong IT person, at least in each of these projects, to bring these methodologies, these problems with software development. Otherwise, we can forget the details and they cost much more later.
I've got a couple of questions coming in about future type things, and I want to hit on those in just a second. But just to wrap up this discussion too, we've talked about what we need to do to check the software and to check that the systems that we're building are interconnected. This question from Graham is, when we have that system, will that also help check on operations? Is that also helping to make scientists and operators more, less error prone in that sense, or allowing them to have these like real-time, standard operating procedure type things? Do you think about that as a component of the smart lab as well, and does that help to streamline these operations?
In the regulated space, that is one of the biggest goals for a smart lab, is because if you have a scale, you read the weight, you write it down, then you have to import that into a spreadsheet. You have 3 places you can make a mistake, and there's no way to ever go back and check the original weight because it's on an electronic scale that's not connected to anything. So you assume that the person wrote it down correctly. Mistake number 1. You assume it goes from that piece of paper into the spreadsheet correctly. Mistake number 2. And then you assume whoever's reading the spreadsheet is reading the spreadsheet correctly as well. So if everything was connected, that scale was connected directly into your electronic notebook, there'd be no question about what the weight was that was actually measured out. And then if you do make a mistake, right now manually, you spend a great deal of time. It's a huge time sink to go back and trace back that mistake. Where did it occur? What was affected? How many batches downstream were affected? Was anything else affected? The development work that I did that day, does that change the final outcome? It just kind of snowballs. So I think one of the goals in the regulated space is to reduce the number of errors by connecting just a scale or a pH meter directly into your electronic notebook. Very simple things like that.
And I think that, when you expand that out to your MES, so your batch records and all these other elements of it, especially in the regulated space, we're always talking about fair data and about Alcoa, and really that contemporaneous element there is just so, you get so much benefit from that by having everything connected end to end and operationally. And, I would love to, my utopian world is that you have, from the minute you create that work order or you purchase something all the way through, that you never generate a piece of paper. You never have to translate something from one system to another, that it's all automated. And that's my utopia in this space. And, I would love to be there at any company I work. And my goal is to help whoever I'm working at. Right now it's my current site. What can I do to help them get there? We have all the pieces digitally, we have most of them. We have an MES, we have a LIMS, we have an ELN, we have digital records from our instruments. How do I make them all talk so that we don't have these errors and we're not spending a lot of time tracing that back? And how do you get the vendors to support you when you find a problem with their instrument or you're running into an issue, so that they come in and support you so that you can continue to stay connected and trust that data and be able to rely on that going forward?
That's actually one of the oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, and I'll continue.
That's one of I saw there was a question about some of the hurdles that we face, and that's one of the hurdles we do face. Some vendors aren't willing to share their API information so they can connect into these systems, because they coveted that. That's their selling point. So it becomes a hurdle. How do we get these vendors who don't want to play in the sandbox to actually play in the sandbox with everybody else?
Well, you just don't buy this or the equipment.
Well, sometimes they're the only maker of the equipment.
I agree, but it's hard to explain to our colleagues in the labs why you don't buy the favorite analysis platform, because they don't have a function they don't care about. That's the point.
Or sometimes it's the only choice.
It's the only choice. That also can happen a lot.
No, I mean, yeah. In this case, yeah, it makes things difficult. But usually, I mean, whenever I dealt with it, we had a choice between, several manufacturers, and yes, of course, you're looking for someone who has better, instruments and which are less expensive. But one of the criteria that we would always consider is the quality of the API, and whether we can interconnect that to our system.
Valerie, how many years ago you start looking at the APIs? Let's say 2-3 years.
No, actually, believe it or not, I was considering that in my first industrial positions, where I was hammering a vendor for an API which they did not publish that time, and that was like 20 years ago. And so they did not publish the API, but I was able to just get it from them because they had it internally, and they did not mind sharing it with us. It's just that they never thought anyone in their right mind would ever need it. So what the hell is this thing? And so, yeah, no, they always have APIs, and you can always call them and you can ask them, or you can twist some arms, or you can maybe find someone there, and there are ways of finding pain pressure points. So.
One of the things I have noticed, the newer companies, they're much more amenable to sharing. They like the idea of being connected. They try really hard to be connected. but the flip side of that coin is it's a new company. How long do you think they're going to be around before they're bought out maybe by Agilent, and then Agilent says, well, we're going to discontinue this product, and you're sitting there going, well, I've got this great system and nobody to support it. So you got to be kind of careful. There's a trade-off.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes left on the hour, and I think it's time to be a little bit more future-leaning and future-thinking. The most liked question that we've had so far is from Lynn, and that is on the future skill set question. As you all are in this transition and thinking about hiring for people that will help out in this transition, what are you looking for, and what makes a good person who can work in the context of smart labs?
One of the things that Teva hires, we hire scientists. We need the scientists in the lab. They have to be able to look at the data and understand the data. That being said, they also have to be willing to accept the technology and move from the paper to the automated systems. So it's a little bit, you kind of need a hybrid person in there. Again, younger people seem to be much more into the automation. They like letting somebody else or something else do the work for them, and I agree with them wholeheartedly, because looking at the data at the end is so much more interesting than sitting there and manually transposing stuff and being so tired at the end of the day you really don't care what the data says. So I don't know if the skill set's really going to change that much from being a scientist. You will still be a scientist. I think your flexibility and how you approach your job will have to change.
Yeah, I agree with Mary. Yeah, that's where we would hire scientists first of all, but second they need to be familiar with computer programming. That's another important skill in this area without which you cannot live with. But again, it's not enough to have just a computer programmer, because a computer programmer would know what to do, and they would need exact instructions from a scientist who also doesn't know what to do with the computer sometimes. And so yes, it's a unique intersection of skills where you need both experimental scientist, someone who has, let's say, a degree in chemistry. Well, I'm dealing with chemistry, but so a degree in chemistry and a good understanding of computer programming. So yeah, and that's pretty unique.
I think the word is hybrid here. That's what Mary said, is hybrid. We don't want you can have the best chemistry or best computer scientists, but they need to understand different perspectives, especially work in the lab. They can be a computer scientist, but have to understand the perspective from the scientists in the lab. And also, the person, when you hire a person to the lab, he has to understand the perspective from the informatics, the IT sides. So I think we need a balance between somebody that is understand his core business and have an open view. That's what I usually like IT enthusiastic. Is a scientist mindset, but like to think about technologies, connections, programming. In the opposite side, when you have like a hardcore IT person, for example, you need to make architecture for a cloud solution. The person also must be able to talk to the people in the lab to understand the needs. So it's all a balance, but always flexible in this sense.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to get some of that flexibility, and I've seen this, and some of the best IT people in this space are ones that started out in the labs. And that's kind of your ideal scenario where they understand, they can talk that language, they can understand what happens in the labs, what the scientists are thinking, and kind of what that thought process is. And I agree, I don't think that the skill set per se is necessarily going to change, but the mindset has to. The other thing that you really find is that you're hiring more data scientists, and that's the people at the end of the day that are actually just going to sit there and grind through that data and analyze it and so forth and feed it back to the scientists and say, here you go, here's that cleansed version that you were looking for. And those data scientists, I think if there's a new skill set, that's really where it lies. But your scientists in the lab are basically the same people they've always been, but open-minded more so now as we get the younger and younger scientists, because their life has always involved some sort of digitalization. And so that's just a natural progression for them. But you still need your hardcore IT people as well. But if you can get a hardcore IT person who spent some time in the lab early in their career, that's almost a win-win scenario.
Yeah, that's true.
Be a hybrid. As we are wrapping up, let me give everyone just a minute to kind of address one of my favorite questions, basically because there are no wrong answers. What does the lab space look like in 10 years? How does it become even smarter than what you are seeing now? And I'll bring in a couple of concepts that Todd and Lynn have brought in on the question side. Does sustainability factor in there? Do data standards factor in there? What does it look like for each of you all?
Just you say standards. I think a very important point is open standards. For data, we have animal allotrope standards. I think something starting get some traction now. We need to keep pushing. Also, open API, the standards for communication. So the point our open lab, the future is open, not free, but open to connect. You bought a new device, you want to connect with your lab with existing system. We want to connect your data analysis system with your existing data source. So that's, I think, is the future must bring for us.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think for me, what the future I hope brings, and what I do see is that vendors who aren't willing to play in our sandbox are going to disappear, because the only way they're going to survive is to support that ability to connect in the smart lab. And without that, I don't think vendors are going to be able to survive.
Yeah, and I think connecting I can see most pharma companies not being willing to connect with other pharma companies because that's their competitor, but just within the company. Because Teva right now, we have for our biologics, our R&D site is in Sydney, Australia, but being able to connect more directly with their data would make our lives a lot easier. So just being much more interconnected within the same company, I think that will drive a lot. And going through the electronic systems will definitely increase your data integrity for the regulators. Someone had something up there about data standards, and that's all around your data integrity. Is that number that you're reporting, is that really true and correct? So I think the smart labs will definitely help with all that.
Well, I guess on my wish list, that would be not just interconnecting within the system, but also applying machine learning and AI and interjecting that into your systems, and the ability to make certain decisions, to automate certain decisions sort of in real time using these machines. Well, at least that's my desire. I hate to be the pessimist here, but maybe it will never happen. Who knows?
Well,
Yeah, build the foundation.
Look at Jules Verne. I mean, he wrote about going to the moon, and it took a few years, but we eventually made it to the moon.
We got there.
So yeah, so I think it's just, this may seem science fiction now, but maybe in another 15, 20 years, it's commonplace.
I love this thing, focus on both the ecosystem, right? Like this is going to be an ecosystem. There are going to be, many different interfaces and many different connections, and we'll have to bring these components in. And again, AI will be one of those components, and that will help us to make the labs, more efficient, have more closed loop investigation in that sense. So thank you for all of those thoughts. I'll just summarize, I think this has been a really great discussion so far, and I know that we're going to continue this discussion. I encourage all the people in the audience to also jump in public forums and where we are and continue these. I learned a couple of things. It's, instead of maybe calling it Smart Lab, we should start calling it Smarter Lab, because it's always about like what we can do next and what's the next thing that we can push to. It's always about what's the next connection or interconnection that we can make. When we're talking about this, we should always be people first too, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Of these smart lab systems and everything else that we're doing are motivated by making everyone's lives easier and the data faster, cleaner, etc. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. And as long as we are people first, I think we will be able to make really great progress and transition in that smart lab space. And that, of course, you have to validate the smart lab itself and all the components, all the ecosystem players that are coming in. You do need to do due diligence and bring the systems in and check for that regulated sense. Is the smart lab, are these different connections always producing the same data every time, and is it normalized? But the opposite side of that is once you have those checks, that also helps to make people's lives easier and better because it helps on the standard operating procedures for being able to bring things in and make things more streamlined. So if you all want to be part of this space, work on the interfaces, become hybrids in that sense, and think about the science that you're bringing in, think about the software, the programming experience that you're bringing in as well. And we'd love to continue the conversation. Strateos has our own booth at this conference. Please stop in and check us out. Mark Fisher-Colbury, our CEO, will be giving a talk in just the next minute or so, as soon as I throw things back off to Mark Giles. So please stay for a while and check out that talk. He will be talking about really the future and vision of these smart lab type things and doing more future casting. So it was great talking with you all, and I'll throw things back to Mark Giles. Thank you all for the time and for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Peter. It's a great session, very insightful, and great panelists. So yeah, thank you to everybody for listening. I think you've summed up the session perfectly, Peter. And